The wreckage lay split open under a sky the color of faded parchment. Abel stood over the carcass of the heavy transport coach, his shadow a long, thin stain on the parched earth. The great rear axle, a beam of solid oak thick as a man's thigh, had snapped clean through, the breaker pale, jagged wound in the dark wood. One of the massive wheels had torn free, rolling 100 yards before collapsing into a patch of stubborn sagebrush, its iron rim glinting in the merciless sun. The main cabin, a robust container of reinforced timber and canvas built for hauling freight across the unforgiving plains, had canted over, its contents spilling out like the entrails of some great beast. Sacks of flour had burst, dusting the ground in a ghostly white powder that the breeze was already beginning to steal away. He felt nothing. Not despair, not anger, just a profound and hollow emptiness. The silence was the most unsettling part. For weeks, the world had been the rhythmic creak of the chassis, the grunting of the oxen, the low rumble of the wheels. Now, there was only the whisper of air moving through dry grass, a sound so subtle it felt like the world holding its breath. He was utterly, irrevocably alone. The oxen were gone, scattered by the violent lurch and crash, likely miles away by now, if they hadn't already been claimed by predators. He had walked in a wide circle, his footprints the only proof of human existence for as far as the eye could see in any direction. There was no trail here, no rutted path. He had been forging his own way, a shortcut that had proven to be a final, fatal error. He knelt, his hand resting on the splintered frame of the coach. The wood was still warm from the sun. This was it. The end of the journey. The end of the plan. The savings of 5 years of labor, all sunk into this transport and the supplies it carried, now lay in ruins around him. He could not fix it. Not alone. Not here. The horizon was a flat, unbroken line, a promise of nothing. To walk from here was to die. The realization settled not with a panic, but with a cold, clear certainty. He was stranded. The wreckage wasn't just a failed vehicle, it was his tombstone, waiting for his name. He spent the first day in a methodical trance, pulling every salvageable item from the wreck and organizing it into neat piles. There was a kind of solace in the simple, physical work. 2 barrels of salted pork, 3 sacks of beans, what was left of the flour, a canister of coffee, and a small crate of tinned goods. His tools were his true treasure, a heavy felling axe, a shovel with a sturdy ash handle, a hammer, a small hand saw, and a box of assorted nails and iron fittings he had stripped from the broken frame. He laid them out on a canvas sheet, their metallic forms looking stark and purposeful against the muted colors of the prairie. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, he sat on the broken chassis and stared out at the vast emptiness. He had been heading west, toward a valley he had only ever seen on a map, a place of promised water and fertile soil where he would build a small ranch, a life. The dream felt like a phantom limb now, an ache for something that was no longer there. He thought of the faces in the last town he'd passed through, the way they had looked at him, a solitary man with a heavily laden transport, with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They knew the odds. The prairie was a patient killer. It didn't need claws or fangs, it had distance and time. He understood then that he had 2 choices. He could gather what he could carry and walk until he collapsed, a desperate gamble against the immense scale of the land. Or he could stay. He could dig in. The idea was absurd, a madness born of desperation. To try and survive here, in the middle of nowhere, with winter only a few months away, was suicide of a different kind. But as he looked at the shattered body of the coach, its sturdy ribs exposed to the sky, another thought began to form. It wasn't just wreckage. It was shelter. It was timber. It was a beginning, of a kind he had never imagined. He found a place not far from the wreck, a shallow depression where the ground dipped, a natural swale carved by the runoff of ancient rains. It was a scar on the land, but to him, it looked like an invitation. The days bled into one another, each defined by the rising and setting of the sun and the slow, agonizing progress of his labor. The air, once thick with the heat of late summer, began to carry a sharp, clean edge, a harbinger of the cold to come. He had dismantled the coach's undercarriage, salvaging every plank and iron brace. The great, curved canvas top, stained and torn, was now a makeshift tent that protected his supplies. He was chopping firewood one afternoon when he saw it, a dust cloud on the distant horizon, moving slowly but with purpose. A day later, a man appeared, leading a pair of heavily laden pack mules. The man's name was Marcus. He was a surveyor, he said, heading back east before the first snows made the passes impassable. He had a face like tanned leather, cracked and weathered by sun and wind, and eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed Abel's camp, the neat piles of wood, the organized supplies, and the beginnings of a large, rectangular pit being dug into the earth a short distance away. Marcus's gaze lingered on the hole in the ground, a deep frown creasing his brow. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice raspy. Abel leaned on his axe, the sweat cool on his back. "My transport broke down." "Axle snapped," Marcus grunted, a sound of grim understanding. "I can see that. But what's the hole for?" He gestured with his chin toward the excavation. "A home," Abel said, the words feeling strange and audacious on his tongue. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, his expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief, and then to a kind of pity. "A home? You mean a grave? You can't survive a winter out here. The blizzards will bury you. The cold will split the stones." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "I'm heading to Fort Kearney. I've got a spare mule. You can ride with me. Leave this junk here." It's a fool's errand. The offer was practical, sensible. It was the voice of the world Abel had left behind. For a moment, he felt the pull of it, the allure of safety, of society. Then he looked at the pit, at the work of his own hands, the physical manifestation of his will to live. "I have work here," Abel said quietly, his voice firm. Marcus spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dust. "Work? You're digging your own tomb." He watched Abel for another minute, as if waiting for him to change his mind. When Abel simply turned back to his woodpile, Marcus shook his head again, tugged on the lead rope of his mule, and continued his journey east, leaving Abel in a silence that felt deeper and more profound than before. Marcus's departure was a catalyst. The skeptical voice of the outside world had been heard and dismissed, and with its fading presence, Abel's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He was no longer a man stranded by misfortune, he was a man with a purpose, a singular, all-consuming task. The pit became the center of his universe. He worked from first light until the last vestiges of dusk, the rhythmic scrape and thud of his shovel the only percussion in the vast, silent amphitheater of the plains. The sun beat down on his back, turning his skin to brown leather. The muscles in his shoulders and back burned with a constant, deep ache, but he welcomed the pain. It was a reminder that he was alive, that he was fighting. He dug with a slow, methodical pace, conserving his energy for the long weeks ahead. The topsoil was loose and easy, but a foot down he hit a thick layer of dense clay, studded with rocks that had to be painstakingly pried out one by one. Each shovelful was a small victory. The hole grew deeper, wider, its sharp, geometric lines a stark imposition on the rolling, organic curves of the landscape. He measured it constantly, using a length of rope to check the dimensions against the size of the coach body he intended to bury. It had to be perfect, a snug fit that would leave no gaps for the frost to penetrate. He was not just digging a hole, he was shaping his survival, carving out a space for himself in a world that had tried to erase him. One evening, exhausted, he lay on the edge of the pit and looked up at the stars, a brilliant, indifferent spray of light across the blackness. He thought of Marcus, by now safe in some distant settlement, telling the story of the madman he met on the prairie, the one digging his own grave. A faint smile touched Abel's lips. Let them think him mad. Sanity was a luxury for men with other options. He had only one, to work, to build, and to endure. The earth he was moving smelled rich and loamy, the scent of life and decay. He was burying the symbol of his failure to create a new one of survival. The most formidable task lay ahead, moving the massive coach cabin from the site of the wreck to the newly excavated pit. The structure, stripped of its wheels and undercarriage, was still an immense weight of seasoned oak and iron, far too heavy for one man to lift. Abel spent 2 days planning his approach, walking the 50 yards between the wreck and the hole, his eyes scanning the ground, his mind working through the mechanics of leverage and friction. He dug a shallow, sloping ramp at one end of the pit. Then, using his axe, he fashioned a series of crude rollers from the thickest branches of the few cottonwood trees that grew in a nearby ravine. The process was slow and deliberate. He used salvaged lengths of the broken frame as levers, inching one side of the heavy cabin up just enough to slide a roller underneath. The wood groaned in protest, the sound loud in the stillness. He repeated the process on the other side, his body straining with the effort, sweat stinging his eyes. With 2 rollers in place, he attached his longest rope to the front of the cabin and began to pull. The great box shuddered but did not move. He repositioned his feet, dug his heels into the earth, and pulled again, his entire body a single, taut line of exertion. The cabin shifted, scraping forward an inch, then 2. It was a monumental victory. For the next 3 days, this was his life: lever, push, slide, pull. He moved the rollers from back to front as the cabin crept forward, a terrestrial nautilus carrying its home on its back. The final moment was one of controlled chaos. As the front edge of the cabin reached the ramp, it tilted downwards, its weight finally working with him. With a deep, groaning shudder, it slid down the earthen ramp and settled into the pit with a tremendous, ground-shaking thud. It fit perfectly. A wave of exhaustion and relief washed over Abel, so profound he had to sit down, his back against the cool wall of the pit. He had done it. He had moved the mountain. Now, he just had to bury it. He began the slow work of backfilling, shoveling the excavated earth back over and around the cabin until all that remained visible was the dark rectangle of its open rear, which would become his door. The sky had become a permanent, oppressive sheet of grey. Winter was no longer a distant threat but a palpable presence, its breath a cold caress on his cheek. The first snows arrived not as gentle flakes but as sharp, wind-driven pellets that stung his skin and vanished the moment they touched the ground. The earth, once pliable, was hardening with the deepening frost, making every swing of the shovel a jarring effort. The work became a frantic race against the inevitable. His primary focus shifted to the interior of the buried cabin. It was a dark, cramped space, smelling of raw earth and old canvas. Using the last of the salvaged planks, he constructed a small, reinforced entrance tunnel, a low passage that would act as a barrier against the wind and drifting snow. He built a fireplace in the corner, a crude but functional structure of flat stones he had carried from the ravine, mortared together with a mixture of clay and dried prairie grass. The chimney was the most difficult part, a narrow flue of carefully stacked stones that rose just above the mounded earth of his roof. He chinked every crack and seam in the cabin walls with the same clay mixture, his fingers raw and numb from the cold mud. He stretched a large, cured bison hide he'd been saving over the entrance to the tunnel, weighting it down with rocks. It was a primitive door, but it would hold back the worst of the wind. His final days before the storm were spent gathering resources. He chopped a mountain of firewood, stacking it inside until there was barely room to move. He filled his 2 barrels with water from a nearby spring, hoping it wouldn't freeze solid. He organized his meager foodstuffs on shelves he had fashioned from broken crate wood. The interior of his dugout was a troglodyte's hoard, dark, cluttered, and focused entirely on the grim essentials of survival. He stood in the low entrance one evening as the wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The world was disappearing into a maelstrom of grey and white. He took one last look at the featureless landscape, then ducked inside, pulling the heavy hide flap shut behind him. He was entombed. The blizzard did not arrive, it descended, a sudden and total obliteration of the world. The low whistle of the wind through the chimney escalated into a deep, guttural roar, then a high, piercing shriek that never ceased, day or night. It was a physical assault, a constant, crushing pressure on his tiny subterranean world. The sound was everything. It was the screaming of 1,000 furies, the grinding of mountains, a relentless, deafening siege. Fine, powdery snow, as fine as flour, forced its way through the tiniest, unseen cracks in his stone chimney and around the edges of the hide door, dusting the interior with a faint, ghostly film of white. The cold was a living thing, a predator that seeped through the packed earth and wooden walls, its tendrils seeking him out. Abel kept the fire small, a miserly collection of glowing embers that provided just enough heat to keep the chill at bay. He had to conserve his wood, for he had no idea how long he would be buried. Time lost all meaning. The darkness inside the dugout was absolute, broken only by the dim, flickering light of his fire. He marked the passage of days by sleeping and waking, by eating his spare meals of salt pork and beans. He would sit for hours on his simple bunk, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, listening. He listened to the storm, trying to decipher its language. He could feel the immense weight of the snow piling up on the roof above him, a growing pressure that made the sturdy oak beams of the cabin groan softly. It was a terrifying thought, to be crushed by the very thing he sought shelter from. He ran his hands over the rough-hewn walls of his home, the structure he had built with his own 2 hands. He had to trust it. He had to believe in the soundness of his work, in the strength of his own desperate engineering. He was a mariner in a deep-sea vessel, submerged beneath a churning ocean of white, praying the hull would hold. There was no sky, no sun, no horizon. There was only the roaring darkness and the quiet, stubborn flickering of his small flame. Then, one morning, he awoke to silence. The abrupt absence of the wind's deafening roar was more shocking than the storm itself. The silence was absolute, profound, as if the world had been wrapped in a thick blanket of cotton. He sat up, listening, every nerve taut. He heard nothing but the faint crackle of his fire and the sound of his own breathing. For a full day, he did not move, wary of a false calm, a brief respite before the storm's second act. But the silence held. It was over. He crawled to the entrance tunnel and pushed against the hide flap. It didn't budge. He pushed harder, putting his shoulder into it. It was like pushing against a wall of solid rock. The snow had drifted deep and packed hard against his door. He retrieved his shovel and began to dig. The work was claustrophobic and exhausting. The narrow tunnel gave him little room to maneuver, and the snow was dense and heavy, compacted by its own immense weight and the force of the wind. He shoveled the snow into the main chamber, piling it up against the far wall. It took hours. He scraped and pushed, his breath fogging in the frigid air, until finally, he saw a glimmer of intense, blue-white light. He pushed the shovel through, and with a final heave, broke out into the open. The brilliance of the light was blinding, a physical blow that made him recoil, his eyes watering. When his vision cleared, he crawled out of the tunnel and stood up, his jaw slack with awe. The world he had known was gone. The prairie had vanished beneath a vast, undulating ocean of snow. There were no landmarks, no sagebrush, no ravines, only a seamless, sculpted expanse of white under a sky of impossible, aching blue. The drifts were enormous, some rising 20 feet high, burying everything. He looked back at his home. It was invisible. All that marked its existence was the dark hole of his entrance tunnel and a thin, almost imperceptible wisp of grey smoke rising from the top of an otherwise unremarkable snowdrift. He had not just survived the storm, he had become part of the landscape that endured it. He was a feature of the winter world, as quiet and resilient as the frozen earth beneath his feet. The thaw was a slow, messy affair, a season of mud and slush that turned the prairie into a vast quagmire. The great drifts of snow receded day by day, revealing the flattened, bruised land beneath. Abel's dugout, once a white hillock, was now a mound of dark, damp earth, its grass-seeded roof beginning to show the first hints of green. He spent his days clearing a small patch of ground for a garden and reinforcing the structure of his home, preparing for the seasons to come. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the rhythm of his own existence. The arrival of another human being was a shock to his system. He saw the figure from a distance, a man moving with the long, loping stride of someone who spent his life walking. The man was old, lean as a willow branch, with a long grey beard and skin the colour and texture of a dried apricot. He carried a long rifle and a pack that seemed to weigh almost nothing. He introduced himself as Jedediah, a trapper who had worked these lands for 50 years. He had seen the faint column of smoke from a ridge miles away and had come to investigate, his curiosity piqued. He expected to find a hunter's temporary camp, or perhaps a band of natives. He did not expect to find a solitary man living in a home buried in the earth. Jedediah walked a slow circle around the dugout, his keen eyes missing nothing. He noted the clever construction of the stone chimney, the sturdy, low-set entrance that would defy the wind, the way the roof was angled to shed water. He peered into the dark interior, his gaze taking in the solid oak beams of the old coach body. He kicked lightly at the packed earth walls. He asked few questions, and Abel offered few answers. The structure spoke for itself. Finally, Jedediah stopped and looked directly at Abel, his weathered face unreadable. He nodded slowly, a gesture of profound respect. "Built to last," he said, his voice a dry rasp. You listened to the land. They shared a cup of hot, black coffee, sitting on a log near the entrance, mostly in silence. For Abel, the old trapper's simple words were a validation more powerful than any praise. They were an acknowledgement from an expert, from a man who understood the unforgiving calculus of survival in this place. When Jedediah shouldered his pack and continued on his way, he left Abel with something new, a sense of belonging, a feeling that this strange home he had built was not an anomaly, but a rightful and permanent part of this wild country. Summer returned to the plains, and with it, a vibrant explosion of life. The roof of Abel's dugout became a miniature meadow, thick with prairie grasses and dotted with the brilliant yellows and purples of wildflowers. Bees hummed over it, and from a distance, it looked less like a dwelling and more like a natural feature of the land, a small, inexplicably symmetrical hillock that breathed a faint trail of smoke. Abel's garden, tilled and tended with painstaking care, produced rows of hardy vegetables. He had become a part of the landscape's ecosystem, a quiet inhabitant who took what he needed and fortified himself against the elements. He was no longer a traveler whose journey had been violently interrupted, he was home. He often looked at his hands. They were not the hands of the man who had set out on this journey. They were broader, thicker, the palms covered in a permanent layer of callus, the knuckles scarred. They were the hands of a digger, a builder, a survivor. They had taken the splinters of a disaster and fashioned them into a life. The heavy coach body, buried deep in the earth, was no longer a symbol of his failure, of a shattered dream. It was the heart of his existence, the strong, dark womb from which he had been reborn. Its sturdy oak frame was the skeleton that held his new world together. He would stand at the entrance of his home in the evenings, watching the sun set, the same sun that had once seemed so merciless. He looked out at the horizon, that vast, intimidating line that had once represented an impossible distance to safety. Now, it no longer beckoned or threatened. It was simply the edge of his world, a world he had not discovered, but had built. He had faced the void and filled it with the work of his own two hands. He had taken the remnants of a broken past and buried them, and from that grave, he had cultivated a future. The prairie had tried to claim him, to swallow him whole, but he had reversed the act. He had dug into its skin and made a space for himself, a quiet, defiant testament to the simple, unyielding power of a will to endure.